Hello everyone, this is a quick revision video to remind you of what form and structure is in poetry. Our aims within this video are to remind ourselves of what language is versus structure, to be really clear in the difference between them. The key structural features that you can look out for in the poems, and then finally how to analyse those features once you've spotted them. Obviously, our aim is not just a feature spot in our exams, but if you can't spot them and see where they are first of all, then you are not going to be able to analyse them. So first of all, language, which is the thing that we are mostly familiar with, things like verbs, metaphors, similes, pathetic fallacy. And those are the words and phrases that the writer or the poet has specifically chosen to convey their idea. Now, structure is how those words and phrases, similes, metaphors, adjectives are put together. So why a poet has chosen to open a poem in a certain way, why they have chosen to end with a certain word, and why they may structure their poem in the way that they have chosen. So I'm just going to go through some of the structural methods that you may see in the poems. We've already studied about 5 poems now, and you might have seen quite a few of these mentioned. You might already be confident in analysing them for yourselves. But if not, this is a good point now to get your notepad and pen to make some notes or to screenshot this slide when I've finished going through it. So first of all, we have stanzas, poem paragraphs. So this is how a poet chooses to split up their poem. In some cases, there's only one stanza, and this is a good clue to see what form the poet is trying to create. So, for example, we have one sonnet in the Power and Conflict cluster, Ozymandias, which is a mix of a Petrarchan and Shakespearean sonnet. This is useful information because it can add and develop your point about how human constructs are very fragile. We also have 2 dramatic monologues, which is poems told from a first-person perspective, often in a very passionate manner. In London, the dramatic monologue is used to convey his anger at the power structures in London at that time, whereas in My Last Duchess, the dramatic monologue is used to convey how unhinged he is and how unstable he is. We also have repetition. So why a poet chooses to repeat a certain word or phrase, and why do they put it where they do? That's an easy one to look for. We also have rhyme. Now in poems, you can have a set structured rhyme scheme. You can have half rhymes, but you can also have free verse where the poet chooses to not rhyme any of the end of their lines, which can also be done for effect. We also have rhythm, which kind of links to rhyme, the structure of how the lines flow and any beat that's created through them. A volta is a sudden turning point in a poem. So for example, in the prelude, where the narrator becomes suddenly terrified and overwhelmed by the power of nature, that poem has a volta. In Remains, when the soldier returns home and is still affected by his experiences of war, that includes a volta. And a volta is interesting because it kind of splits the poem in 2, from what happened before and what happens after. So that's a good one to look for. So if you have a look at the next poem you study, see if you can spot the volta and where there's a sudden change. In medias res, we've already looked at in Bayonet Charge and Remains, and that's when the poem begins right in the middle of the action. In Bayonet Charge, it starts with suddenly, and we're placed right there alongside the soldier in the middle of war. We also have enjambment, when there's no punctuation at the end of the line, it just runs on. We see this in Remains, and Kamikaze, two poems which are both about memory and kind of follow the speaker as they recall the past. And finally, we have a caesura, which is a pause, usually a full stop, in the middle of the line, which forces you, the reader, to pause at a specific point, maybe to emphasize or highlight something. So those are our 8 different structural techniques. So you might want to make a note of those, make some revision cards of them, because you will need those in year 11 when we come back to poetry and revisit it. So now we know the methods, what can you actually say about them once you've selected them? So I've given you here 4 different questions to ask yourself so you can build up your explanation of why the poet has chosen to use those structural methods. So number 1, does the method highlight or emphasize something to make it stand out? Particularly for repetition or a caesura, does that pause, does that use of repetition emphasize a particular word or idea to hammer it home to the reader? Number 2, whose voice do we hear? What's their perspective? Why are they speaking? So that's if it's in first or third person, past or present tense. Are they narrating a memory? Are they talking about the here and now? Are they trying to show their passion, their anger, their sadness, their dismay? So that's quite an interesting one when you're talking about something, and it's quite an easy one to do as well if you're stuck. Number 3, does it change the pace? Does it speed things up, slow things down, and why? This is a good question to ask yourself in reference to enjambment or a caesura. If there's any stanzas in there, if there's any separation between the stanzas, is it speeding it up to show you a barrage of thoughts that the narrator is having, or does it slow it down to make you really think about a particular point? And then finally, number 4, is it regular or irregular? Is there a pattern or does it change, and why? So for example, in London, we have a regular rhyme scheme throughout, A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, if you look at the words at the end of the lines. However, in other poems, such as Remains, there is no regular rhyme scheme. It's in free verse because it shows us the speaker's train of thought. So using those 4 questions and the 8 methods, which I've put to the left of this slide, let's have a go at analysing the first stanza of London. Now, it probably would help if you've done this poem before, but if not, bear with us. You should still be able to have a go at it. What I'd like you to do now is pause the video, read through the stanza yourself, and pick out any structural methods that you spot. Okay, hopefully you've done that. So we're just going to go through some of the different structural methods that you should have picked out of this stanza. So I picked out 4. First of all, the fact it's a first-person narrative, a dramatic monologue. When you study these poems, it's good to actually learn some of these structural methods, just so you know straight away and you can comment on them. I did mention before we had 2 dramatic monologues in here. That's just something that you can learn and know. The other structural feature I've spotted is the repetition of chartered, which is a man-made legal structure, and also the repetition of marks. And then finally, I noticed that the words at the end of the lines did rhyme: street and meet, flow and woe. If you are unsure about how to do a rhyme scheme, I could perhaps do a separate video on that. But basically, we've got a regular rhyme scheme. And if you've read the rest of the poem, you'll know that that continues throughout. So now let's have a go at analysing some of these different structural methods. So we'll start with the first person narrative. So I'm going to ask myself, whose voice perspective do we hear and why? And I know that William Blake, who was the actual poet, was a big believer in social and racial equality, very forward thinking for his time. And he really questioned politicians and the church's teachings. He really questioned those people in power. So I've put that this makes the poem seem more personal and emphasises the speaker's passionate disgust at how those in power treat the poor and innocent. So that's the effect of using a first-person narrative. Next, we'll think about the repetition of chartered, which basically means owned by man or a man-made construction. So a good one for repetition is to question, does it highlight something? And I think that the repetition of chartered is kind of emphasizing that everything is owned or controlled by man. So I've put for this one, this highlights that those in power control everything in London, even natural features like the river. This emphasizes how unfair society is. Similarly, with the repetition of marks, once again, I'm thinking about what that highlights. And when I think of a mark, I think of maybe a scar or an injury, which is language analysis. So why has the poet chosen to repeat this twice? Well, I think he's done this to highlight that weakness and woe is everywhere, is very prevalent, and no one can escape from the control and the inequality here in London society. So I put that this highlights that everything is damaged by the inequality in power, suggesting that pain and suffering is everywhere, creating a feeling of despair. Finally, the rhyme scheme. I'm going to use our fourth question. Is it regular or irregular? Does it change and why? And I know this is a regular rhyme scheme, and throughout the poem, we've got this ba-bum, 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 this continuous rhythm, which kind of replicates the speaker as he walks through the streets of London. But also, the very strict rhyme scheme almost links to the control that those in power have over the people of London. I've put the regular rhyme scheme is regular, sorry about that, and unbroken to show how everything is controlled by those in power. The rhythm could also represent the sound of his feet as he walks through London. It makes it seem very personal and kind of puts the reader in his shoes to empathise with him and see how unjust and how unfair it is. So the takeaway tips for this video is that you should learn the 8 different main structural features if you don't know them already. But most importantly, I think you should create 4 revision cards for the 4 structural analysis questions to ask yourself whenever you do pick out a structural feature. So thanks for watching, guys. If you would like to have a go at this yourself, I suggest you have a look at the first stanza of one of the poems we've studied, maybe War Photographer or Exposure, and see what structural features you can first of all pick out, and then what you can analyse using the questions.